Today we welcome Dr. Chris Gehrz, Professor of History, as he introduces us to a lesser-known side of a well-known life, the spiritual journey of Minnesota aviator Charles Lindbergh. Let's welcome Chris.
All right, can you hear me all right? Yeah. Good. Well, thanks for coming today. You're very much not ready for Primetime and preview of something I'm working on. But before I start, I want to acknowledge that I'm doing something about research and scholarship 2 days after one of Bethel's finest researchers and scholars died. Of course, we've heard Adam Johnson passed away on Tuesday. So I thought it'd be appropriate to start by reminding us that Adam was actually here about 3 years ago to do a talk after he won the Faculty Excellence Award for scholarship. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of that. You can find the full thing on YouTube in the digital library if you want to.
And so maybe that's actually what's going on, and we can start to examine this. So just to conclude, the implications of an experimental epistemology wind up looking a little bit like this. Knowledge is probabilistic. We don't know anything with complete certainty, and neither does the rat. We've got a set of experiences that we try to account for. But that set of experiences could be accounted for by something else, a variety of different things, and we never know which one is. There's some hypotheses, there's some explanations that we can completely abandon. They're just not consistent with what we've observed. It's also contingent. So we don't get to say, this is absolute necessity. So if you look at a lot of metaphysics, you see this sort of necessary, sufficient conditions. There's a lot of this that, well, the data just sort of suggests this. But remember with Bayes' rule, it's what hypothesis we're willing to allow. So if we're not willing to allow for a hypothesis to account for our data, we can never find any data that would ever support that. We just abandon the search for it, period. And so there's a really, really important contingency that's embedded in this. Also, this from a pedagogical perspective is really, really exciting to me, is that by examining the observation history and the exploration behavior of a single individual, if we approach it from a Bayesian perspective, we can start to gain insights into what representations and epistemic objects are used by that individual. And any good teacher knows sort of what mistake. You just need to listen to a student for about 5 minutes. See Bill Kinney over here, you're thinking about calculus, and it's one of those things that, oh, you're misunderstanding this little point because I see you doing this. Let me reach in and tweak that. And the student has this aha moment, and the student is able to switch the representation so that they can actually make really, really good predictions in a variety of circumstances. But well, we know how to do that as teachers, and there's an art to it. One of the questions that we have is, maybe we can start to build specialized training so that we can provide people with specific sequences of observations that they have those aha moments when we're not available. So that's one thing that we'd like to be able to do. And what neuroscience has really allowed us to do is maybe start to watch thought. And so thought seems to be embedded in brain signals. These allow an individual to interrogate her own epistemic framework. So we can begin to understand what's actually going on there.
So I like this, partly because it's amazing to hear a scholar, I think probably the finest scholar Bethel's ever employed, in terms of being an expert in this field, admit that there's a degree which we're not certain about knowledge, right? It's all probabilistic, right? There's kind of humility in there. But I also appreciate you went straight into teaching, right? And like that then should make us excited about doing the work in the classroom, and we're so tempted to divide those things. So it's just a really good reminder of what a special person Adam was. And I especially appreciate his emphasis on the contingency of knowledge. Historians get that, and that fits really well with the fact that I'm going to give a presentation about a book that is not due in manuscript form until the fall of 2020. So everything I say here today is provisional, it's contingent, it's definitely uncertain, and we'll see if the hypotheses hold up. But that's my small nod to Adam before I get started. So on to mine. So I just said the book will not be written for a few years yet. But I want to do something really probably foolhardy, and I want to read for you the first page of that manuscript. I doubt very much this is going to hold up. It's going to be a very strange start to the book, so I want to kind of try this out on you and see if it works. But let me read to you what might be the first page of this amazing book that Erdmans will publish in the year 2021. Okay. So at first, no one noticed him slip through the folds of the tent and step onto the sawdust floor. Now, 47 years old, the man his friends once called Slim had started to grow paunchy. His boyishly blonde hair fading to gray and thinning. In Los Angeles for airline business, that Sunday morning had, as usual, not found him in church. But that afternoon he found himself walking downtown to the corner of Washington and Hill, in the shadow of the courthouse. As he lingered in the back, he wasn't even sure what brought him there. Slim told himself he was simply curious. The so-called crusade had been all over the Hearst newspapers. Hearst, the same man who 20 years earlier had offered him $500,000 to star in his own biopic. Perhaps he just wanted to be anonymous for once, not the most famous man in the world, but just one of 6,000 faces turned toward the stage where Billy Graham is preaching on Psalm 2, why the heathen rage, and the people imagine a vain thing. Now, fire and brimstone weren't the newcomer's taste. Words like iniquity and repentance made Slim feel like a child again, sitting in gray flannel in the front pew of a small-town church, a political prop for his father's congressional campaign. But as the sermon turned to current events, he perked up. Russia has the bomb, warned Graham, and judgment is just around the corner unless we have a revival and listen to God, the Holy Ghost. And true enough, a week before, President Truman had admitted that the Soviet Union had successfully tested its own atomic weapon. And just that morning, headlines screamed that Mao and his communists had taken power in China. Slim knew that his old warnings were being proven correct. The real threat was Stalin, after all. So he listened more attentively, tuning out the whispers of recognition from a few of his neighbors, ignoring the accusing glances from a few more. Judgment is coming, Graham continued. We're no better than Sodom and Gomorrah. We don't deserve to be spared any more than they were. But for Slim, the message didn't sink in until the preacher turned his sights on other threats. Scientists pretending they had all the answers. Slim nodded. Political parties doing the same. Nodded again. Marriages going cold. Spouses threatening divorce. And now tears welled up in weathered corners of his blue eyes. We'll never have peace, concluded Graham, until we have Jesus in our hearts. Do you want to know Christ? Before I knew it, Slim was raising his hand and walking down the main aisle. And so on October 2nd, 1949, Charles A. Lindbergh made the decision for Christ. Except that never happened. That's a complete fabrication. That did not take place at all. That's a lie. I invented that. I'm borrowing a trick here, by the way, from my graduate advisor, John Gehrz. One of the chapters in his best-known book on the Cold War starts with an imagined situation during the Korean War where Douglas MacArthur drops atomic bombs on China. He narrates this whole two-page thing and then says, but it didn't happen. And I kind of like that idea for a couple reasons. So I got to the second at the end, and I'll explain the title, why this is an anti-biography in some ways. But here's the first reason I still kind of like the idea of inventing this fiction to start the book, which is, as you listen to that, did you know that wasn't true? Were you just sitting there thinking, well, that didn't happen. Of course, I don't know that happened. Do you know anything about the spiritual journey of one of the most famous people of the 20th century? So when I was writing the proposal for this book and starting to think about this man we think we know, right? It struck me that one of his very first biographers called him the famous unknown. And what they meant in 1927 was he was this Midwestern farm boy turned stunt pilot who suddenly burst on the scene, overtook all these much more famous aviators, and did the impossible across the Atlantic. One man against everything, and landed at Lindbergh Fields. Right? We'll get to all that in a sec. And yet there's the sense that he was anonymous, right? But even here, 90 plus years later, there's a sense in which Charles Lindbergh remains unknown. Still an object of at least confusion and paradox. And as I started to read more about this on my sabbatical, I didn't start my sabbatical planning to write a Lindbergh biography. It was suggested to me by an editor. And the more I realized, like, this is something I don't know. And actually, especially as you get to the later stages of his life, which we never think about. For most of us, Lindbergh drops off the kind of history timeline around 1928, or the kidnapping, or maybe the World War II debates will come to. So his story continues until 1974. He died a year before I was born, and it's really in that period of his life that his journey takes some unexpected turns that I think are maybe helpful for us to think about. And so let me start by kind of sketching this journey. And I'll quote a little bit from him, I'll give you a little historical context to understand why it's significant. And then we'll come to the other reason I was thinking about starting with this fictional encounter with Billy Graham. So you might know that Charles Lindbergh is born in 1902 in Little Falls, Minnesota, just up from the Spirit River passing cloud. This is him with his father, C.A. Lindbergh, so Charles August Lindbergh, and this is Charles Augustus Lindbergh, who's the more famous one. Charles August is a prominent lawyer and served many terms in the U.S. House of Representatives as a very progressive, almost radical Republican, a trust-busting kind of guy who opposed U.S. entry in World War I. This is that picture when Charles would spend time in Washington on the floor of Congress. He met Woodrow Wilson at his inaugural address, famously. But Charles spent most of his time in Little Falls at this little house that you can still visit. So I'll be going there next week to start doing some research at the historic site. And then also in his mother's hometown of Detroit. His mother, Evangeline, is a fascinating woman, a University of Michigan trained chemist, who decided she wanted to go to the frontier and have adventure, and found this school in Little Falls that needed a science teacher. It only lasted a few months. Married this guy, very tempestuous relationship. They were estranged when Charles was a young boy. And so he kind of had this itinerant childhood, Little Falls, Detroit, Washington. And he writes a book at the end of his life where he reflects on his childhood on the upper Mississippi. He doesn't say a lot about religion. In his other books, he hints at being forced to go to church because his father was running for Congress and he had to be seen to be religious, so there's a Congregationalist church they go to. He said it didn't really matter to me very much. And instead, where he came alive was visiting the Land family, his mom's side. Actually, his great-grandfather was a preacher, fiery kind of fundamentalist, but his grandfather was a dentist, a man of science, an evolutionist. And so in his posthumous autobiography of values, Lindbergh said this: as I lost confidence in the Bible, I gained confidence in science. Each year, new discoveries were made, new miracles were produced. Man knew much more than he had ever known in the past, and his knowledge was increasing rapidly. It was not possible that through science he could achieve eternal life. If man could do that, he would not need God. And so this is Lindbergh looking back. He never talks about this in the 20s and the 30s, but starting in the 40s and 50s, as he looks back, this is how he understands his upbringing. A break with religion, a sense of science is the source of progress and meaning and purpose and truth. And this then dovetails. As he finds his way into aviation, he has a couple of bad semesters at UW-Madison trying to be an engineer, but he becomes a pilot, and a really gifted one. And I think it's hard for us to understand just how meaningful aviation was in the 1920s. I thought about this the last time we took our trip to Europe in J-term. It was kind of in the middle of writing this proposal, and I thought, how many times have I crossed the Atlantic? Probably a dozen times. I don't give it any thought. It's just inconvenient and uncomfortable because I have to cram into coach. Right? I mean, that's all that's the danger there for me. And also then there's the kind of almost metaphysical sense of what it means to take to the skies, to ascend toward the heavens, right, and conquer that frontier. So if you really want to understand this, there's a great book written by a guy who's at Stanford for a long time named Joseph Korn. It's called The Winged Gospel, Americans' Romance with Aviation, and not surprisingly, Lindbergh figures prominently. So Korn, and to try to understand why Lindbergh is such a celebrity, you partly have to understand what aviation meant to people. And there's something messianic about Lindbergh and about the airplane. So from the newer edition, Korn writes this: aviation was more than merely a technology about which many were enthusiastic. It was a secular religion. The airplane was its God, considered a messianic force for beneficial change in human affairs. To believers in the winged gospel, the airplane seemed to promise transformations in the human condition no less profound than those foretold in the New Testament regarding the birth of Jesus himself. And he observes that this kind of religion borrows its language from Christianity, which does ascend us towards the heavens, right? But it transfigures it. And so we get a new Christ. When Lindbergh crosses the Atlantic in May of 1927, and people start realizing he's going to do it. Like he gets to Ireland, and people see him, and news makes it to Paris. And so famously all these Parisians drive out to this field and greet him. We don't have a picture of that. That's from when he landed in England on his visit to the king later on. But people know this is something that's a world historical moment. And people come, including American expats. Like a guy named Harry Crosby, who's a publisher, worked with Ernest Hemingway. And Crosby, in a kind of stream of consciousness reminiscence, said this about the scene at Le Bourget Field. Where is he? Where is he? Lindbergh, where is he? And the extraordinary impression I had of hands, thousands of hands, weaving like maggots over the silver wings of the spirit of Saint Louis, And it seems as if all the hands in the world are touching or trying to touch the new Christ, that the new cross is the plane. It's this image, Saint Louis is the great, incredibly devout medieval king of the 13th century in France. It's like pilgrims coming, and they're encountering the holy in a relic at a shrine, and here's the cross, and this boy from Minnesota is the new Christ. So it's fascinating. I don't have time to get into it now, but this is a Sunday. Actually, there are sermons then preached. I was at the State Historical Society over spring break and came across the sermon preached by a Canadian Baptist pastor in which he interpreted for an evening, back when we had Sunday night services, right? He interpreted, this is the fulfillment of prophecy. He quoted from Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah in the book of Revelation. And then he said, and know what it means is evangelism. Now we can go to Africa, in the darkest part of Africa with the airplane, and we can take the gospel. So like people do different things with this, but for a lot of people, Christian and not, Lindbergh is this kind of Christ-like figure. Now that's how people respond. We don't really know how Lindbergh feels about all of it. He doesn't say much about this, certainly at the time, but he does have this kind of technological, secular religion attached to the airplane. He thinks this is really going to break down the divisions that separate humanity. It's going to inaugurate world peace, raise prosperity. It's very optimistic in that sense. I'm going to skip over the kidnapping. It's a big part of the story for many, but hopefully not a big part of my book. But I want to talk now about a really lesser-known part of this. In the 1930s, Lindbergh gets bored. He helps set up what becomes TWA. He starts planning transcontinental air and other kinds of air routes. He does some archaeological exploration. He marries Anne Morrow, daughter of the ambassador to Mexico, from a baking family. He gets bored, and he decides he wants to be a scientist, like his mom. He studies biology, and he decides to work with a prominent Nobel-winning doctor named Alexis Carrel, a French surgeon who's been experimenting with transplant operations. But the problem is that you have to keep the heart pumping to do this. And Lindbergh's sister-in-law had died of a heart condition. And supposedly this is what gets him thinking. And so he uses his engineering and kind of practical knowledge to work with Carrel to build a perfusion pump. And they keep alive the beating hearts of chickens and other small animals. And it's a major advance that he's co-published in Science at one point working with Carrel. What's really interesting for my purposes is that instead of then deepening this kind of commitment to science as the source of all hope and meaning, this is where he starts making a turn towards, if not religion, something like spirituality, because Carrel is also a Catholic mystic. Carrel is an agnostic, but he has a couple of kind of conversion experiences. One is when he visits Lourdes. He actually thinks he can confirm the healing miracles there. He later writes a book that's translated in 1950 in English as Journey to Lourdes, and Charles Lindbergh writes its preface. In the middle of the 1930s, Carrel writes a book called Man the Unknown. Now, it's partly about eugenics. That'll be something I'll talk about with Lindbergh, too, at some point. But it's also Carrel saying science can only take us so far. And science is deceiving us and cutting off a fuller sense of the potential that humans have, and it's cutting us off from the spiritual realm, from the soul. And so his suggestion is the next frontier for intellectual inquiry is how to go beyond this. How do we go beyond mere science? And for Carrel, at least, Catholicism is what takes him there. He has a relationship with a Trappist monk back in France that's very meaningful to him. Now, Lindbergh admires this without necessarily joining it fully, but Carrel also then has Lindbergh meet another friend of his, a Florida businessman named Jim Newton, who later writes a kind of memoir. He's this kind of guy we've never heard of, but his best friends were Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, Thomas Edison. Like, he just kind of knew all these people. And Newton had a kind of Christian conversion experience. I mean, he at least had the sense that he was, as an experiment, could decide to commit himself to a kind of Christian version of God. And Carrel heard about this, and they started writing letters. And Carrel said, well, you should meet my friend Charles Lindbergh. And so around 1938 or so, Newton and Lindbergh meet, and they talk. And Lindbergh says, can you tell me your story? And then comes back, and Anne asks questions about it. And Lindbergh is just kind of listening. And then finally, in Newton's reminiscence, he says this: I found that when you make a deep commitment, unforeseen forces come to your aid. I call it reaching the core. Carrel calls it experiencing spiritual rebirth. Whatever the words, I'm sure this reality is the force at the heart of the universe. That force becomes available to us in some measure if our spirits are open to it. If few of my friends just did a Star Wars podcast, so when I hear the Force, that's all I can think of right now. But this is Lindbergh reaching, kind of, sounds like the Apostle Paul, stumbling in the darkness towards this unknown God, right? Like, that's the way we might want to interpret this. But realizing the limits of science, right? Realizing the limits of purely natural inquiry to suggest there's something beyond. And like, these are, in a sense, his mentors in this. And it's something that Anne Morrow is drawn to enormously as well. But of course, something else is happening in the late 1930s. And this is kind of the next chapter, and for a lot of us, the last chapter we know about Lindbergh, is as World War II begins in 1939, he comes back from exile in Europe to America to advocate against American participation in the war, and becomes the leading face of the America First movement, which includes a number of Christian groups, but that's not necessarily what Lindbergh is about. He does say this is a war for the defense, or this is about defending Western, and sometimes he'll say Christian civilization. And what he means is that the greater threat is Stalin. In his mind, not that he's a wonderful person, but he's a bulwark against Bolshevism. And America ought to let the two of them just kind of fight it out, not get involved. And, now, the way he does this has left him open for a long time to accusations of being very cozy with Nazism, very sympathetic to its views of race and progress. And there's probably some truth to that. And most unfortunately, Lindbergh privately and publicly, at least once, blames the Jews for all this. He gives a speech in Des Moines in 1941 that blames the Jews and their control of the media as one of the main forces playing America in the war. So for a lot of us, like, if we think about Lindbergh and World War II at all, that's where it ends. What we don't know is that even after Pearl Harbor, which immediately suspends America First, and Lindbergh stops talking, he's kind of cut out. Roosevelt, he offers to serve Roosevelt, and surprisingly, is pretty upset at him at this point and cuts him off. And so he works with Henry Ford for a while, he does some things. But then in 1944, Charles Lindbergh goes to the South Pacific and works both the Army and the Navy testing planes and observing, but he also flies at least 50 combat missions and shoots down at least one Japanese plane. He's been in the Army this whole time, right? He's Colonel Lindbergh. This is the first time he's seen combat. He's a good marksman as well as a good pilot. He's only allowed to bring one book with him, and that is the New Testament. And while he's there, he's clearly thinking about all these questions that Carell and Newton have been opening and that Anne is asking about in her own way. And as he thinks back at this, 10 years later, he writes a piece called Thoughts of a Combat Pilot for the Saturday Evening Post. And he talks about this encounter where he shoots someone down. He kind of reflects on what it means to kill another man in war. But he also reflects on flying over a church that had been bombed and thinking about civilians on both sides who have been killed by bombing. And he writes this: if God has the power over man claimed by his disciples, why does he permit the strafing of churches and the atrocities of war? How can one return from battle and believe that an all-powerful God desires peace on earth, goodwill toward men? One questions the extent of God's power, and questions the very existence of God. I asked those questions myself this week. These are good questions for a spiritual journey. But it doesn't mean he disbelieves in God. He continues on to reflect, well, but maybe we misunderstand God. Maybe God is truly ineffable. He defies our kind of categories, but that doesn't mean he's not real. We just kind of figured out what he is exactly. And so he keeps reflecting on this. Now, he leaves the service and he does a job working for the U.S. government, touring Europe to investigate especially air power. And he comes to Germany. He visits a concentration camp. What he's most struck by is he visits the bombed cities of Germany and he starts to realize that perhaps technological progress has a cost. And maybe the airplane, instead of being a kind of source of messianic hope, is actually a source of civilizational demise. And of course, the Cold War is starting in the midst of all of this. So 3 years later, he makes this kind of return to public prominence by writing this small book. It's called A Flight and Light. It sells out immediately. He actually has to make a deal with the publisher and take fewer royalties because they're not sure anyone will care what Charles Lindbergh. So it's not hugely successful, but it is well read, and it's a fascinating little book. So I thought I'd just read a little bit from it. So this is 1948. We are in the grip of a scientific materialism, caught in a vicious cycle where security today seems to depend on regimentation and weapons which will ruin us tomorrow. I believe the values we are creating and the standards we are now following will lead to the end of our civilization If we do not control our science by a higher moral force, it will destroy us with its materialistic values, its rocket aircraft, and its atom bombs, as it already has destroyed large parts of Europe. This book represents a journey from my early confidence in the limitless future of scientific man to an apprehension of the crisis to which scientific materialism has led him. In attacking scientific materialism, I fully realized that science has become the victim of its technologists as religion became the victim of its fanatics. Just as the spiritual truths of Christ and Lao Tzu were perverted by the temporal exploitation of Christian and Taoist creeds, the intellectual truths of great scientists are being perverted by the material exploitation of industry and war. Hiroshima was as far from the attention of the pure scientist as the Inquisition was from the Sermon on the Mount. And he goes on, talks about visiting Munich, the city where we end our trip, which was rebuilt after the war because it was bombed so severely, and he looks at it and he says, the Germans have been educated people with Western minds and hearts. Few nations had contributed more to our civilization in the past, in art, music, religion, philosophy, science, and science above all in modern times. They had worshipped science, to it they had sacrificed the quality of life, yet they had not gained the power to survive. So here's the warning you saw. Was there something inherently dangerous in the unguided search for knowledge? Before this war, I had regarded the sphere of knowledge as ignorant superstition. Knowledge brought truth, and how could truth blind or injure man? Or perhaps there was a wisdom in the old myth of the Garden of Eden. But of the tree of knowledge thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. In this early record, both man's fascination and his fear of knowledge are recorded. He must search for it was accepted. That involved great danger for him was already understood. Here in what had been a human city, in what had been a human city, I saw the danger of knowledge, the amorality of truth, etc., etc. Here in Germany, the truths of science and the truths of religion had clashed, and religion remained to teach its ancient lessons. So the book is full mostly of quotations of Lao Tzu and of Jesus. And here we perk up a little bit with our own attention, so he's turning towards Christ, right? And he will go on to say, I never committed myself. Like he was maybe my moral guide, his moral teacher. I think of C.S. Lewis's trilemma here. Like he cuts off everything else that Christ says, but he's this ethical guide. And he continues. 5 years after this, he writes his greatest book, The Spirit of St. Louis, which if you've not read this, it's the one Lindbergh book I recommend people read. It won the Pulitzer, and deservedly. It's a remarkable book. Most of it is about one guy by himself in an airplane for 35 hours. It takes up like 250 pages, but he uses that then to prompt flashbacks. So the whole book is written like he's in the plane and he looks backward in time towards his childhood, his adolescence, kind of steps leading up to the flight. He also reflects forward and thinks about metaphysical questions. And so he thinks about his childhood. He thinks about that young boy in Detroit who loved science and distrusted religion, but then he says, it's hard to be an agnostic up here in the Spirit of St. Louis, aware of the frailty of man's devices, a part of the universe between its earth and stars. If one dies, all this goes on existing in a plan so perfectly balanced, so wonderfully simple, so incredibly complex that it's far beyond our comprehension. He looks out at the skies, and he looks at the ocean below him, and he thinks about creation, and he says, man conscious of it all, a worldly audience to what, if not to God? So I kind of skip past the next. Lindbergh lives another 21 years after this. And in it, this is his search then for what he's calling God. But where he finds God is not maybe in places that we would expect to find God. He finds God first in the environment. Lindbergh, at the end of his life, is most famous as a conservationist. He protects endangered species. He warns that the quality of life that he keeps talking about needs to include our physical environment. So, for example, he opposes what goes to the Concorde. Supersonic travel will have deleterious effects on the environment. But he also is interested in other cultures. He spends time with the Maasai in East Africa, with the Pacific people in the Philippines, and it's kind of two minds. It feels like primitive cultures are barbaric. He doesn't discard science entirely, but he said, but in a certain respect, they understand better than we do the meaning of human existence, and they understand God. And he quotes the Maasai at one point to say that what they understand is that God is everywhere. God isn't everything. So if we're going to label it, Lindbergh probably becomes a pantheist or a panentheist or something. God can be found in all of us. Right? And as he comes to the end of his life, he starts putting together what he means to be his magnum opus. And he never finishes it, but his editor puts it together with the help of some scholars in Autobiography of Values, which I would not recommend. It's a pretty tedious reply. I mean, it's someone who's very bright, but I think their intellect is kind of reaching beyond what they can really explain, but he's asking interesting questions. We reach a point in observation and analysis where the human intellect stares past frontiers of its evolutionary achievement toward unreached areas infinitely vast, the mystical realm of God. The realm of God. God was real to our ancestors. He entered their lives as a tangible being, intangible though he was. He spoke to them, guided them, rewarded them, punished them in life, and in the end took them into his kingdom or rejected them. In his grace, they were promised joy. Thus, while reprobate angels and men, he's quoting here, were left to endure everlasting punishment, the saints shall know more fully the benefits they have received by grace. So wrote St. Augustine, that I worked Augustine to talk. What child has not been disturbed by ideas of God, his form, rule, and power? All experience, all reason, all of our sciences have sprung from the mystical and miraculous, for how else can man be aware of existence itself? The shape of God we cannot measure, weigh, or clock, but we can conceive a reality without a form. The growing knowledge of science clarifies man's intuition of the mystical. The farther we penetrate the unknown, the vaster and more marvelous it becomes. Only in the 20th century do we realize that space is not empty, it's packed with energy, maybe existence's source. And if space has produced existence in the form of man, can we deduce from it a form of God? So as he comes down to his life, he's thinking, how can I connect all these pieces? This kind of early attraction to science, the sense there's something beyond it, maybe he's trying to find a way to fit this all together. And landing at something that he thinks of as God. He dies of cancer in 1974. It's a pretty quick demise. He's in a hospital in New York, realizes he's not going to live, so he flies back to Hawaii, where he and Anne bought a house on the island of Maui. He plans his funeral very quickly and gets a plot by a little church overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a Congregationalist church built in the 1850s up Coral. And it's still there. You can see the gravesite. And on the gravesite it says for CAL, and then this is the inscription. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. Does anyone know what this is a quotation? Psalm 139, verse 9. So this is the fuller quotation. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in Sheol, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there thy hand shall lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. I can already kind of see my conclusion to the point, right? Like, what do we make of that then? Is this then an evidence of, well, here's somebody who kind of like despoiled the Christians, right? He took like the wisdom that he liked from scripture, from Christian tradition, but only what he liked. So he like takes this little piece of Psalm 139, he leaves out what's framing it. You know, and it becomes instead this kind of like aviator's sort of epic. Or maybe it actually suggests something else. Like maybe Charles Lindbergh never could entirely go from God, from the Spirit. When Sam talks about Augustine in CWC, and we talk about confessions, there's a sense of Augustine is chasing after God, but more importantly, God is chasing after Augustine. And so I'm tempted to want to say what's happening here is God has been chasing after Charles Lindbergh this whole time, and he really never could escape that spirit. And that's why I would love to be able to open with that Billy Graham conversion, right? So here is the second reason. This is why I'm calling this talk an anti-biography. We want to believe that that's what happened. You know, like you've got all these things seemingly leading to that conversion experience, right? This kind of spiritual questing, you know, this kind of fall from grace. I haven't even talked about the marital problems or the secret families in Germany that we now know about. Like there are all sorts of things that should have led him down that sawdust aisle to sign a decision card. Lots of celebrities did in Los Angeles in 1949. But he didn't. Right? And I think that's why I call this an anti-biography. Actually, I did it. This comes from Craig Miller, one of our resident directors. I was having lunch with him a few months ago and kind of describing this project. He said, oh, you're writing an anti-biography. And what he meant is that in Christian biography, we usually only have a couple moves. We write hagiography, you know, uncomplicated tales of the saints, right, as kind of moral lessons. Or we write profound conversion stories. We read about Augustine, right, someone whose life is turned around and has this encounter. And this is hardwired into our culture as evangelicals, as pietists. How many times have I said education at Bethel is like conversion? It's a turn. It's transformational. Like this is at the heart of every Billy Graham revival. A potential story of conversion and decision. But that's not what this biography is. That would not be a faithful telling of the story of Charles Lindbergh. And so does that mean we shouldn't write it because it doesn't fit kind of our paradigm of what a life story that's spiritual should look like? But here's why I think it's still valuable. I mean, first of all, it raises all sorts of questions Christians should grapple with about science, about technological progress, about meaning, about mortality, about celebrity and the media. You know, it's a nice mirror, as all good biographies are. It's a mirror that we hold up to ourselves. But here's the really, I think, pressing reason this is a needed story to tell. Ibu Patel was here on Monday, director of Interfaith Youth Corps, a Muslim, but I hope you heard the convocation address. Quotes from Jesus, quotes from Muhammad, Jane Addams, Abraham Lincoln, Ulster McIntyre, right? It was a wonderful convocation address. And so I was thinking about, in a sense, what I think I'm proposing is a kind of interfaith engagement. We're just so tempted to fit Lindbergh into something like a Christian box because we still do like to think of America as a Christian nation, right? But that's all being stripped away in respects. And what I'm thinking of this as is a spiritual but not religious biography. And that is one of the fastest growing parts of the American population. So last September, a Pew Research Forum issued a report. It's based on a survey that had been done a few months earlier. And so they had asked, I forget how many hundred respondents, two basic questions. Do you think of yourself as a religious person or not? Do you think of yourself as a spiritual person or not? And then they created this matrix. So here were the results. So for the first time they've been asking this, they haven't done it a lot, but 48% of Americans thought themselves as both spiritual and religious. And then another 6% thought that they were religious, but spiritual they didn't feel comfortable with. So 54% of Americans said, yes, we're religious. Now, I mean, if you know American religious history, you know that that's not actually totally an aberration. It's not like America, throughout time, 90% would have said yes. There's been ebb and flow. This is why Billy Graham is so important in the late 1940s. There's a turn towards traditional religion. But this is remarkable, right? So 5 years ago, 59% said I'm religious and spiritual. But notice that most of the fallout here did not go into this category, which atheists, secularists, for whatever reason, people would say, I'm neither religious nor spiritual. And if you really push them, they might say, there's nothing beyond the natural, observable world, nothing beyond what science can touch. But what it grew fastest by 8 points in just 5 years was this cluster of people who said that they were not religious, but they were spiritual. I don't know, like Pew didn't ask Charles Lindbergh, but my guess is that is how he would describe himself, right? He is not religious. He rarely attends church. He never identifies with any denomination. He does not call himself a follower of Christ or a Christian. He doesn't affirm even a very broad kind of sense of Christian orthodoxy. He's very distrustful just of organized religion. That's why it leads to fanaticism that perverts the Sermon on the Mount. That's how he thinks about religion. He's deeply spiritual, increasingly. I mean, this becomes the guiding impulse of the second half of his life. That's the next frontier, not an ocean, but chasms separating us from the metaphysical. And I think if you had asked him, he would have called himself spiritual but not religious. And there are a few famous Americans like this. A year or two ago, Tommy Kidd of Baylor wrote a spiritual biography of Ben Franklin. And when reviewed, they say, oh, this is spiritual but not religious biography. And I think we have people like that, but we don't often think of those stories. It's very uncomfortable for us. Think about Lincoln. Right? People who don't fit conventional religious categories and yet are asking profoundly important questions that point towards the spiritual. And I think it's worth hearing that from Lindbergh because this group is growing. This group is present on our campus, right? I'm sure many of our students are actually spiritual but not religious. Many of your neighbors are, many of your family are, many people at your church are spiritual but not religious. And so as a matter of interfaith engagement, it's a matter of loving your neighbor, it's a matter of bearing witness, thinking about how we proclaim the gospel. I think it's imperative for even evangelical and pietistic Christians to understand what does it mean to be spiritual, not religious? What are the questions those people ask? What are the stumbling blocks that religion puts in their way? I think Lindbergh's story might help us understand that population, as well as just understanding him, which is worth doing for its own sake. Okay, I actually managed to leave some time for questions if that clock is right. So if you have any questions about, again, conditional, provisional, uncertain, I'll change my mind. Any questions about Lindbergh or any thoughts about how I'm framing the story?
What did you think you were going to write before you started?
Well, Lindbergh or just in general? But so I started my sabbatical was fall of 2016. So I went up to the Blue Ridge Mountains with my family, and the first half of it was writing not this pietism book, but the other one that just came out last year. And I kind of knew that. And then the rest of the sabbatical was all about like, what's next. And I was trying to hold myself open to what's a project. And I did like the idea of writing biography. It's a pretty stereotypical kind of mid-career historian move. It's a reach for royalties, right? Now we're writing something people actually want to read, a biography. And at the same time, like partly because of teaching CWC and hearing, like, especially how Sam frames this, like he quotes from Frederick Buechner. There's a power of hearing someone's story told, right? And I thought, like, this maybe is a good move, and I'd be curious. And so I know a guy named Keith Carter, who's a history prof at Valparaiso, and he's also the editor of Erdman's Library of Religious Biography, which has been around for a while. Mark Knoll was and is an editor of it, and traditionally that library included evangelists, pastors, theologians. Right? I mean, that's what it did. And Keith's aim was to broaden the coverage. Women, people of color, but also non-Christians. And because I'm on Twitter, I followed him and realized he was just like, we get a Malcolm X biography. So just a year before, as I was doing this, D.G. Hart at Hillsdale came out with his H.L. Mencken biography, who was watching Lindbergh this whole time. I'm sure to be quoted in mine, and famously skeptical person, critic of organized religion. So with that in mind, I had started pitching some ideas. What are some kind of less traditional biographies? And he said, oh, you're Minnesotan and Swedish, you should do Lindbergh. This was like late September. And what's funny about it is I didn't give it any thought to this. You know, when I did the Bethel at War digital project with Fletcher Warren, Lindbergh comes up twice because his father was a Swedish American who opposed World War I, and so I talked about Bethel's response to World War I, and then I did talk about isolationism in Lindbergh and America First, because most Midwesterners in 1939 thought Lindbergh was absolutely right. But I hadn't really thought. And then in August, we happened to go to Little Falls. My wife was at a workshop in St. Cloud, and I was bored, and the kids were bored, so we drove up to the house, and the kids liked the flight simulator there, and so, oh, that's interesting. And then we were going to Washington in October, and we were taking the kids there in Space Museum, and my son said, I want to do something on Charles Lindbergh, the Spirit of Saint, and it's like Lindbergh bells all over the place. And so I thought, okay, I'll take this seriously. So I read like the Scott Berg really thick biography and a few others, and I started to realize, you know, that doesn't really interest Scott Berg. He really is not trying to write, but there are enough hints of this here, I think there might be a story. I started reading some more, and I read some more about Anne Morrow Lindbergh. And so I got back, and I finally wrote a proposal, and they said, yeah, that'd be really interesting to you. So, yeah, I certainly was not looking for it, but I guess Lindbergh found me or something.
Yeah, this motif of, you know, the mythology of the airplane, and mythology that, you know, now we have this new technology that's going to save the world. And of course, what the evangelical fundamentalist church did with that is said, yeah, we're going to save the world for Christ. And I was part of that.
Sorry, I don't know if I looked at you when I talked about the Canadian pastor.
Yeah, I was part of that. And some of the wind beneath my wings was, my goodness, you know, not only does this kid want to be a missionary, but he wants to fly airplanes. And it was awesome, you know, so I had no trouble raising support, and you had this wonderful thing that if we could only do everything faster, you know, that God's work would be done more quickly. Yeah, so.
No, I had a student like that. If you had an advisor who's trying to figure out his path, and he knew he liked airplanes, he liked mission. So what have you thought about that? I mean, so this is still, you know, part of the mission skill in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it is what makes it interesting. Lindbergh eventually does find himself in what that Canadian pastor would have thought of as the mission field, you know, with the Messiah, with the passage in Mindanao, right? And Lindbergh's not going there to evangelize, right? So it is interesting that it is played out in the Lindbergh story, and I'll have to think about if I can connect those in some way.
Just curious what you think about why Lindbergh didn't make a decision for Christ, maybe apart from his view of organized religion. Just your opinion, I'm just curious.
I really think he didn't like fire and brimstone. I mean, what I was quoting was actually Billy Graham. I thought, I'm going to pick October 2nd because that's the day after China goes communist. And actually, it was a sermon, so I listened to that sermon the other day. And I think I kind of sanitized my view of Billy Graham in 1949. Like, it is an apocalyptic nightmare of a sermon that was calling for repentance and resisting Satan in the power of Jesus Christ by the Holy Ghost, right? Like, I know like that would have been off-putting to Lindbergh. But like, he hangs around mainline Protestantism quite a bit. Like, his wife actually keeps worshiping at this Congregational church until I think she leaves in the late 70s or 80s or so. Her funeral includes quotations from St. Augustine. Like, so, I mean, there were people there that could have led him in something that wouldn't raise those hackles. So, I mean, when he doesn't really explain it, except to say that he distrusts organized religion, and there's this kind of self-sufficiency about Charles Lindbergh. Like, a man who could cross an ocean by himself maybe doesn't need the help of others to guide him towards the eternal. I wonder if that's what's driving him. But he also has these kind of conversation partners like Hurrell and Newton. But those are people who, even Newton, who's Christian, really is as broadly ecumenical as you can think of. Newton's part of what's called the moral rearmament movement, which isn't even officially Christian. It just says that we need moral revival in the world. There was something called the Oxford Group, but kind of part of that spins off into Alcoholics Anonymous, actually. It's more of a sense of a higher power is what Newton is pointing towards, not even organized Christianity or Christianity. So I don't know. I mean, that's a good question to keep in mind, and I probably shouldn't speculate too much more. All right. Well, thank you for coming and listening to this. Hopefully, I'll have something more polished in 3 years for you.